Sulu Sea, off Sindangan Point, Mindanao, 7 September 1944, late afternoon, the light in the number. To hold of the cargo steamer Shinyo Maru is not light at all, but a syrup of heat and breath. USMC Sergeant Oni Clem rakes a palm across a riveted bulkhead gone slick with rust, counting the seconds between the guard's steps overhead. When the grating opens, the world is a rectangle of glare and shouting. When it closes, the air tastes like iron filings and old rope. Water comes down in dented tins that clatter across bare boards. Men pass them hand to hand like a slow prayer. The heat has climbed into the hundreds, the kind of heat that empties lungs and makes thoughts walk with a limp. Someone murmurs a hometown, someone else a service number. These are the things men repeat to stay inside their own names. We would recognize the scene from dozens of hell ships, but the details here matter. There are roughly 750 Allied prisoners crammed in this hull with no Red Cross markings above them. Guards posted at the hatch with a light machine gun and a schedule of latrine breaks trimmed to cruelty. Heat slicks the planked deck until cloth sticks to skin. The air carries bilge stink, coal dust, and a sweet metallic breath from the steam lines. Through the planks comes the rhythm of a convoy changing course, engines shouldering, screws beating unevenly as if the sea itself were limping. The men know what that means even if no one says it. Someone out there is hunting. Clem would later recall sensing something change topside, a hush followed by a slam of running feet, and he knew from the cadence that the ship had been spotted. The guards argue in clipped bursts. One laughs too loudly. Forward, metal stutters as a gun crew tests a feed tray. Down in the heat, the prisoners shift and make room for the smallest among them to stand under the grating, the way men do when air becomes economy. A corporal from Ohio palms a family photo until the paper softens, while a sailor from New Mexico grips a scrap of wire like a talisman. The irony has not yet announced itself, but it is already in the water. American submarines are out there by doctrine and instrument, turning mathematics into torpedo tracks, cutting the merchant arteries that feed distant islands. Japanese commanders, short of escorts and faithful to a code that despises surrender, have chosen to move their prisoners on unmarked freighters. The collision of those facts is only minutes away. Above, boots hammer the deck. Below, a Bible verse meets a Marine's dry joke, and somebody's hoarse, "Steady boys," survives the heat long enough to be believed. Then the hull gives a tiny, almost polite shiver, as if a giant finger tapped the ship, and every face turns to the grating because whatever found them has finally spoken. USS Paddle, SS-263, Gato class, rides a slow swell somewhere west of Mindanao, trim as a penknife, all edges and intent. Through the periscope eyepiece, Lieutenant Commander Byron H. Nowell sketches bearings with his voice, and the talkers feed numbers into the TDC until arithmetic becomes a kind of prayer. 8 silhouettes, fat freighters, a couple of escorts breathing smoke, one laggard that wallows like a drunk. The boat hums at 2/3 speed. The diesels have given way to electric motors, quiet and cold-blooded. The air smells of oil, coffee and canvas. The deck plates carry the thrum of men who have missed, hit and lived to miss and hit again. This is what American industrial democracy looks like when it narrows itself to a steel tube. Paddle is a Gato, about 311 feet of pressure hull, 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, and reloads stacked like promises. Range out past 11,000 nautical miles. Radar and sonar whisper bearings. The TDC turns the target's guesswork into firing solutions. A lookout knows the exact grease to quiet a squeal in the scope. With a few dozen of these boats on station at any moment, the US submarine force will account for more than half of Japanese ships sunk by tonnage. That outcome is written here in graphite and discipline. Nowell chooses the straggler. A spread will do. 2 fish to start, then a second pair to hedge. The order flows. Open outer doors, depth 6 feet, run set. A torpedoman palms the bronze nose of a Mark 18 electric and feels its cold patience. In the control room, a chief quartermaster eases the boat a hair to starboard, as if nudging fate with his shoulder. On deck, the OOD's eyes never leave the feathered wakes in the distance. Everything is measured, timed, then measured again. Firing points pass like stations on a lit rail. Shoot! The boat exhales, and the sea accepts 4 steel arguments. In the periscope, pale threads right themselves toward the freighter's flank, threads that carry more than explosives. They carry a nation's assembly lines, unions and tax stamps, the painted fingernails that riveted hulls, the midnight test cells that made these motors sing. Below, the helmsman calls minor corrections as if coaxing a skittish horse. Above, the scope's crosshairs steady on the laggard's fat ribs. In another minute, the ocean will talk in concussion and spray. For now, there is only the quiet competence of men who have turned distance and tonnage into a fatal geometry, unaware of who else rides inside that silhouette. The navigator, pencil behind his ear, marks a new bearing on the chart and whispers the course like a secret. Somewhere aft, a machinist's mate wipes a wrench and grins at a private joke about how quiet victory sounds at periscope depth. In peacetime, these men would be clerks, cowhands, and students. The war has taught them that numbers, properly tended, can break empires. He had been told the prisoners were shadows. Private Satoshi, Imperial Japanese Army, stood with the sling biting his shoulder and watched the Sulu Sea take the evening light in bronze sheets. The sergeant's orders were simple enough to etch into bone. Keep the hatches dogged, no signals, no panic. If the prisoners surged after an attack, rake the openings. If swimmers gathered near the hull, suppress them. Satoshi had fired on men before, but never into a hole in the ship, never into voices. The convoy moved with that anxious stagger he had come to recognize. Smoke pots coughed, the escort's flag twitched orders across the troughs. He heard the ship's heart, screws labouring, boilers sighing, and the fretful clank of a gun crew testing a feed tray. He thought of the book his schoolmaster once praised about the honour of dying for the emperor, and how none of it mentioned the smell of hot paint or the itch under a wool collar in a tropical dusk. Satoshi did not know what the Americans knew, that somewhere out there a Gato-class boat had measured the convoy's breadth and chosen this very hull, that her captain trusted 10 torpedo tubes and a country that kept them full, that in 1944 alone Japan would lose millions of tons of shipping to those silent hunters. He knew only that prisoners were below and his orders were above, and he would stand between them like a hinge. When the first hit came, he heard it more than felt it, a heavy-handed knock that made the deck spring under his boots. The hatch spat hands and shoulders. Training brought the sights to the grating and the trigger under bone. The first burst stitched the coaming, the second took the man who had almost reached air. He watched blood, black in that light, lie down on the planks. Someone shouted, someone retched. The machine gun's barrel began to glow. On this ship alone, roughly 750 Allied prisoners were packed between iron and ocean. By night's end, about 668 would be dead, nearly 9 in 10. The figure sounds impossible until you count the inputs: unmarked transports, sealed hatches, guards with orders like his, and an enemy that could send more torpedoes to sea in a week than his side could replace ships in a month. He kept firing because the manual and the sergeant said he must. Far astern, an escort swung toward the wake. Satoshi cleared a jam with shaking fingers and understood for the first time that the sea might already belong to someone else. The barrels smoked. The sky went the colour of old brass. Orders were simple. The consequences would not be. The ocean spoke in concussion. A fist of water lifted Shinyo Maru under her ribs and set her down wrong, and the boards in the hold jumped beneath bare feet as if the ship had learned to flinch. Steam screamed through a split line. Somewhere a ladder tore free and clanged into darkness. Men went down in a tumble of elbows and canteens. Above the grating, a machine gun snapped to life, its brass skipping across the deck like rain blown sideways. Clem clawed to the hatch, cooming with 2 others. bodies stacking in frantic geometry. A burst ripped through the opening and threw them back into the heat. It was not a decision. It was doctrine in a man's hands. When the second torpedo hit, it felt closer, and the ship's long-held groans turned into something like panic. A guard shouted. Another voice answered with a phrase Clem would not remember. He remembered the taste of bilge and the ache in his ribs. Someone found the dogs on the hatch and worked them loose. Daylight carved the darkness into strips. The first man up got half of himself into the sun, and then fell headless at their feet. The second made it to the lip. The third rammed a shoulder where iron met iron, and the plate gave with a sound like a tooth breaking. Men poured for the opening. Some were hit before they could stand, others skidded across the deck and went over the side in a rash of pale backs and clutched hands. At sea level, the math was simple and merciless. Roughly 750 Allied prisoners had been stowed in the holds. By night's end, about 668 of them would be dead, drowned in the dark or shot as they tried to breathe the same air as the men with the guns. Around 82 Americans would live to tell it. That is how an empire's choices and a republic's torpedoes combine to make statistics that can knock a family name from a headstone. Clem hit the water cracked and ringing. Oil slicked his lips and nostrils. A crate banged his shoulder like a drunk friend insisting on one more dance. The freighter listed hard and steadied. On the boat deck, a guard kept walking the rail and firing short, economical bursts into anything that moved. An escort's bow wave foamed white in the distance. Somewhere between muzzle flashes and the gull's sharp cries, Clem latched on to floating timber and began to kick toward the dim shore. Far below, in the silent tube that had sent the arguments, men in dungarees listened to the ocean's answer roll across their hull. The helmsman breathed out, waiting for the first depth charge. Above him, on the scope, the freighter's smoke smudged into the sky like a thumbprint. The hunter had already turned away, unaware of the ghosts rising in his wake. After the shooting fades, the map remains. In a post-war office bright with fluorescent indignity, clerks stretch thread between pins hammered into a Pacific that looks too small for the suffering it holds. Sulu Sea, Bashi Channel, Koshiki Straits. The names rhyme like a grim chant. The habit of a republic is to count, and so they count. Hulls sunk, lives aboard, lives recovered, lives that vanished into paperwork. They find a pattern that would have been invisible through a periscope. Japan moved its prisoners of war on unmarked merchantmen, the hell ships, through lanes hunted by American submarines and shadowed by American aircraft. In all, about 126,000 Allied POWs were transported this way. Torpedoes and bombs aimed at enemy logistics instead found human cargo in sealed holds. If this sounds like madness, it is the kind that begins with doctrine and ends with arithmetic. The pins cluster around 4 names that will enter any honest ledger of the war. Shinyo Maru struck off Sindangan Point with roughly 750 prisoners aboard. About 668 never came home. Tamahoko Maru in the Koshiki Straits, taking hundreds down in minutes. Oryoku Maru bombed in Subic Bay. The survivors shifted to Enora Maru at Takao and then to Brazil Maru, men dying in transfers and on quays as surely as if bullets had made the decisions. And Arisan Maru, 24 October 1944 in the Bashi Channel, the single deadliest loss of American life at sea. 1,781 prisoners aboard, and only 9 would ultimately survive. That number bends the mind until you lay it next to the policies that shaped it. The clerks thread testimony into the gaps. A Marine remembers air so thin men fought for it. A sailor describes a hatch that would not move. A civilian internee recalls the sour-sweet smell of ripening fruit bales that sat stacked above their heads while water rations shrank. None of them knew the names of the boats that struck them, not then. The submariners could not have known they were killing their own. The only people who knew both halves of the story were the guards on the decks and the water itself, and water keeps its own counsel until men insist upon the truth. An analyst pins a card marked Takao beside a photograph of a harbour cratered by bombs, and another clerk quietly writes the names of 9 Arisan survivors on a fresh sheet so the totals cannot swallow them whole. Before the map, there were briefings. Picture a convoy conference in 1944. A chart table crowded with rulers and chipped mugs, sweat beading on a hurricane lamp, and a destroyer's signal halyards printing triangles against a stained sky. The senior officer taps a pencil and makes choices sound like orders the sea itself has signed. Escorts are few. Fuel is tighter. Air cover is a rumour. The sea belongs to whoever can stay longest without being seen. Prisoners? They are cargo that cannot be displayed. Keep the hatches shut. Do not mark the ships. If attacked, maintain order at the hatches. If swimmers gather near the hull, suppress them. The sentences are short because the resources are. He knows, or should know, what the Americans have been doing to the lanes. Submarines are patient arithmetic that turns bearings into sinkings. Long-range bombers have drawn dark circles around ports whose names once sounded like fortresses. The rule of thumb is as brutal as it is true. The farther from home, the hungrier a garrison becomes. Add to this a code that calls surrender dishonour, and you reach a policy that counts prisoners as an inconvenience to be moved, not lives to be safeguarded. Sometimes the arithmetic goes past policy and lands in indictment. Consider Suez Maru in late 1943. Torpedoes strike, men make water, survivors reach the surface, and guards fire on them in the sea. Consider Arisan Maru in October 1944. 1,781 prisoners aboard, the ship unmarked in a convoy. Torpedoes find her, rafts are lowered for Japanese crew and soldiers. Only 9 prisoners ultimately survive. That survival rate, about half of 1%, reads like a misprint until you set it beside the orders and the shortages that framed it. A junior officer clears his throat and suggests a marked transport, a special signal, a broadcast to warn aircraft and submarines. He is told that markings invite attack, that signals invite direction finding, that broadcasts confess weakness, and that there are no spare escorts anyway. He looks at the penciled track up the Bashi Channel and says nothing. Scarcity has become a strategy wearing the mask of doctrine. The convoy will sail at dusk. The hatches will shut. The men below will not know the names of the islands they pass, only the smells, coal, sweat, and a sweetness from cargo somewhere beyond their reach. Above decks, the pencils go back into pockets. The officers step out into a light that makes everything look briefly survivable. A petty officer coils a line with perfect care, because the small things must remain orderly when the large things cannot. In the distance, the sea lies as smooth as hammered bronze, giving no sign at all of what arithmetic waits beneath. The room is small enough to cross in 4 strides, yet it holds an ocean. In Pearl Harbor, a briefer gestures at a chart that looks like a nervous system, convoy routes arcing from Borneo, Formosa, and the Philippines toward the home islands. Pushpins march like a tide. Each one marks a sinking by a boat with a hull number and a hometown. The longer the briefer talks, the quieter the room gets, because the numbers are doing the talking now. This is how a free people strangle an empire, not with speeches but with scheduled sailings and tested parts. The Gato, Balau and Tench classes arrive in serial order, pressure hulls stacked in dry docks, while crews learn to join wire to wire in the dark. A Gato-like paddle runs about 311 feet with 10 tubes and reloads stacked like promises. She carries radar, sonar and the TDC that turns bearing lines into firing solutions. The Mark 18 electric has no visible wake. Batteries, motors and men are maintained as if they were one machine. Across the ocean, a convoy will choose a route because a staff captain believes in luck. Here, a quartermaster chooses a course because the plot board and doctrine agree. The tonnage curve becomes a cliff. Japanese merchant shipping collapses through 1944 with losses that defy belief. Millions of tons gone in a single year. fuel, food, and troops that never arrive. Submarines alone account for more than half of ships lost by tonnage, a statistic that sounds like boasting until you add up the patrol reports. You can draw, month by month, how hunger walks inland from the sea. None of this erases the human touch. A torpedo man wipes his hands and kisses his knuckles for luck before palming the nose of a fish. A cook serves coffee that tastes like duty. A radar man rubs a squeal out of the set with grease the way his father once tuned a Philco. If you ask them what wins wars, they will point at the chart and at their own dirty fingernails. It is all the same answer. On the board, the briefer draws a line from patrol area to patrol area, then taps a spot west of Mindanao. A notation reads, contact, convoy, successful attack. He turns to the room and pauses before he speaks, because he understands what that pin means beyond tonnage. The men in the chairs watch him the way sailors watch a changing sea state. Somewhere out there, a wake is already widening behind a boat named for an American town. At any given moment, only a few dozen fleet submarines are on station, yet their effect is continental. A single patrol can erase more supply than an enemy division consumes in a month, not because the crews are lucky, but because the factories back home make luck redundant. Dusk sifts down over Sindangan's strand, and the surf keeps up its small, indifferent applause. Villagers come running when the horizon blooms smoke and then goes ragged. Lusviminda ties her hair with a strip of cloth and wades in with 2 boys and a cousin carrying bamboo poles. Oil rainbows the shallows, and paper labels from cargo drift past like autumn leaves that lost their trees. Out beyond the break, heads bob and vanish. An arm lifts and falls. Somebody coughs seawater the colour of ink. They had not been briefed, these civilians. There is no doctrine for what to do when strangers fall out of the ocean, but habit and decency are their own orders. The men lash bamboo into a rough ladder and push it under a gasping sailor. The women tear skirts for bandages, pour coconut water into split lips, and hold a head steady while a spent body remembers how to breathe. The guns offshore mutter and then grow tired. When the shooting stops, the smaller sounds remain: wheezing, prayer, and the clink of tin cups. One survivor speaks a word nobody recognizes, Kansas, and points vaguely east as if the place might be a sandbar just beyond the reef. Another insists he needs to report to his company commander. Lusviminda tells him that for tonight his orders are to keep living. They set a line of lanterns along the beach like runway lights for the next wave of the saved. The smell is a ledger: oil, salt, blood, and the sweet funk of wet rope. Later, men with notebooks will come asking about numbers, and the villagers will do their best. About 82 Americans will survive Shinyo Maru's death. They will remember faces and gestures more than names. A boy will recall how heavy a wristwatch felt when he slid it off a wounded man's hand so it wouldn't catch on the bamboo. A grandmother will remember that one of the strangers tried to say grace before he drank and cried when he couldn't finish the words. On a humid anniversary decades later, people will gather where the tide writes and erases and writes again. Someone will read the date, 7 September 1944, and the names that can be found. A wreath will turn sideways in the wash and then settle. Children will climb the memorial steps because steps are for climbing. Lusviminda, grey now, will stand in the back and fold her hands. She will not speak. The beach itself will do the talking. It will point out to sea and say in its way, this is where strangers became neighbours, and where a nation most people had never seen was welcomed ashore one heartbeat at a time. The tide will keep its secret rhythms. The lanterns will gutter out. But the story will stay, braided into local talk the way fishing knots remember the hands that made them. 4 patches of ocean, 4 dooms, 1 system. First, the Bashi Channel, 24th of October 1944. Arisan Maru runs in a convoy without a cross or stripe to say what she carries. Torpedoes find her just the same. Rafts are lowered for crew and soldiers. Prisoners break from the holds into night and water. Only 9 will ultimately survive out of 1,781. It is a ratio better suited to legend than to life, and yet it is legend. Second, the Koshiki Straits, 24th June 1944. Tamahoko Maru swallows sea in minutes. Some prisoners are hauled into boats, many are not. The sea here is colder than men remember from their South China Sea crossings. Breath shortens, limbs slow. Survivors end up in Kyushu camps that smell of coal smoke and cabbage and waiting. It is not death by torpedo alone, but by time, temperature, and the long distance between a dock and a human being. Third, Subic Bay, and then Takao, December 1944 to January 1945. Oryoku Maru is bombed at anchor. Men are marched across a tennis court glittering with glass. The remnant is herded aboard Enora Maru and later Brazil Maru. At Takao, Enora is hit. Bodies are counted on a quay while gulls bicker and officials scribble. Of 549 still alive at one point, only 372 will live to see surrender. Single digits and small hundreds do the killing as effectively as bullets. Fourth, east of the Sunda Shelf, 29th of November 1943. Suez Maru takes torpedoes and survivors reach the surface. Guards open fire on men in the water. There are moments in war that refuse euphemism. This is one of them. The ocean, which forgives with time, does not forgive this. What ties these places together is not merely American attack, but Japanese choice. Unmarked transports in lanes ruled by submarines, sealed hatches and guards with orders, a belief that concealment equals safety. The Americans bring radar plots, spread angles, and the reliability that comes when a nation can build more torpedoes in a week than an opponent can replace hulls in a month. The result is a paradox. Overwhelming American competence makes victory certain and makes tragedies like these inevitable along the way. No one in a conning tower could have read the human cargo through steel. No one in a guard detachment could have marked a ship he had been ordered to keep anonymous. That is the harsh geometry of this chapter of the war. Back in Pearl, a briefer draws a rectangle around Formosa and the Philippines and writes 2 words in the margin: Sea Control. He knows it starves garrisons, strands fuel, and grounds aircraft. He does not know the names of the men who drowned when the math touched their hulls. The story will teach him. It will teach the nation that winning a maritime war can look like abundance, and sometimes it can sound like silence punctuated by a single blast. In a Navy office where the blinds never quite meet, a man turns a page and feels the weight increase. Columns of tonnage, class, cause of loss and patrol area march like infantry. He drags a pencil through a final sum and looks up at the wall map as if expecting the ocean to answer. The numbers are not brave, and they are not cruel. They are simply true. American submarines, a few dozen on station at any given time, account for more than half of the Japanese ships sunk by tonnage. The totals settle into place. Roughly 4.78 million tons of merchant shipping and about 500,000 tons of warships go missing from the enemy's future, erased by boats built in American yards and crewed by citizens turned professionals. In 1944 alone, Japanese merchant losses reach into the millions, about 2.7 million tons gone. Fuel, grain, bauxite and hope sliding under a horizon each month until garrisons wither and factories idle. Add the smaller tallies that the ocean insisted on keeping. Hellship sinkings and bombings carry off thousands of Allied prisoners, including Americans whose families will wait by silent telephones for news that never arrives. Of the roughly 750 prisoners boarded into Shinyo Maru's holds, around 668 never return. On Arisan Maru, 1,781 prisoners ride a ship that has chosen anonymity over safety. Only 9 will ultimately live to tell what that choice meant. These are not separate stories from the submarine campaign. They are its unintended shadows, cast by an enemy that hid human beings inside the very arteries we were cutting to end the war. The analyst reaches for a photograph of Agato's pressure hull on the ways, rivets catching the light like coins laid on a black river. He pins it beside a cluster of convoy track charts and a clipping about a memorial service in the southern Philippines. The ledger says victory, and the photographs say cost. He is an honest man, so he lets both stay on the board at once. The man thinks about how totals are built out of inches, a machinist's thousandths on a lathe, a welder's bead, a supply clerk's stamp on a crate that makes the right gasket arrive before a patrol sails. He draws a small box around the year 1944 and shades it. That shade is famine in New Guinea, fuel drums empty in Luzon, airstrips quiet on Formosa. It is also the year when Japanese convoy doctrine finally admits there are not enough escorts left to make a difference. The sea has been turned into a sorting machine, and what it sorts is who can still make war. When he closes the ledger, the covers do not quite meet. The book has eaten too much truth. He puts the pencil back in the cup, and for a moment the map looks, finally, understood. Years pass, and water returns to its ordinary business of glitter and tide. On a humid morning in Sindangan, people gather at a low memorial that faces the same horizon the prisoners once swam toward. An honour guard stands easy. Schoolchildren squint. Someone reads the date. 7 September 1944, and the air seems to take it in and hold it a second longer than usual, as if memory had a breath of its own. Post-war investigators had already stitched the story from fragments, patrol reports from USS Paddle's 5th War Cruise, survivor statements taken on hospital cots, Japanese records that admitted little but revealed enough, a deck log with a neat hand that wrote down bearings and results without knowing who rode inside the target. The pieces clicked together. A Gato-class boat in position west of Mindanao, a convoy that thought itself ordinary, a freighter carrying roughly 750 Allied prisoners in sealed holds. Torpedoes struck, guards fired. Around 668 did not come home, about 82 Americans did. The math did not comfort, but it gave families a place to set their grief. On the other side of the ocean, veterans who had served in boats like Paddle read the same numbers and felt their throats tighten. You cannot point a periscope at a man only at tonnage, yet the tonnage sometimes contained men who shared your rations once, your slang, your flag. Some wrote letters to the families whose names appeared in casualty lists, apologizing for a thing they had not known. Some simply sat with the ledger until the pages blurred. The memorial service folds both truths, the victory and the cost, into one ceremony. A priest blesses the stone. A grey marine touches the carved date the way you press a bruise. A local official notes that civilians once waded out and hauled strangers ashore with bamboo poles and rope. A child asks whether the ocean is dangerous. An old fisherman answers that it is generous and dangerous in equal measure, which is why people must be generous to balance it. When the names are finished, the breeze shifts and the wreath tilts, then steadies. The crowd goes quiet except for sandals on gravel. Someone hums a hymn. The tide reaches for the steps and is kept back by an inch of stone. On days like this, the past does not feel past. It feels like a current moving underfoot, drawing the living and the dead in the same direction, toward the open sea, which remembers everyone. In a museum case nearby, an exhibit panel mentions Suez Maru and the firing on survivors in the water, a sentence that refuses to soften. Another panel lists the 9 men who survived Arisan Maru's sinking, and visitors pause at the smallness of that number, as if their eyes had to adjust to it. Documentation, testimony, and memorials braid into a rope sturdy enough to pull the story out of rumour and into history. The pier is clean and bright, all angles and stainless. A junior sailor pauses at a brass plaque that sums the Pacific submarine campaign in lines as spare as a deck log, and a chief taps the map beside it with a fingernail. You can cross the ocean with a finger here. You can also miss the weight unless someone tells you what the numbers actually cost. The chief, who has taught 100 watchstanders to take a bearing without lying to themselves, decides to tell it. He begins with abundance and ends with duty. Free women and men turned out gato, balau and tench hulls until the slipways smoked. They sent a few dozen boats on station at a time, yet those boats erased roughly 4.78 million tons of enemy merchant shipping and about 500,000 tons of warships, more than half of all Japanese losses by tonnage. In 1944 alone, roughly 2.7 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping went under, a figure that still sounds impossible when spoken aloud, as if a single year can be a cliff. These numbers are not the whole story, but they are the shape of the ending. Then he speaks the shadows of that ending. Unmarked transports carried prisoners into hunted lanes, sealed hatches met torpedoes, guards fired on men in water during incidents like Suez Maru. Arisan Maru carried 1,781 prisoners, and only 9 ultimately survived. Choices and shortages built those ratios. It is necessary to say this in the same breath as tonnage and victory, because honesty is the only ballast that keeps pride from turning into vanity. The chief nods toward the boat moored nearby. Its electronics look like science fiction beside the old photographs. It's quiet like a secret the ocean has agreed to keep. He tells the sailor that abundance, properly directed, defeats brutality, that technology is a weapon only when held by people who know why they are fighting, that the American answer to cruelty was not a better speech but a better supply chain and citizens ready to serve inside it. The sailor listens the way young people listen when history stops sounding like dates and starts sounding like orders they might someday receive. When they walk back down the pier, the water is a mirror, the colour of hammered pewter. The chief says that freedom is heavy, and he means that it weighs what people can lift and what they must remember. Out beyond the breakwater a wake unspools, pencil thin and certain, toward a horizon earned in steel and paid in names. Before they part, he adds that lessons survive only when practiced. Mark what must be seen, signal what must be spared, put life ahead of pride even in a storm. The sailor nods. They stand with a plaque and sunlight, and then the day takes them back to their watch bills, which is how a nation keeps its promises.